Now, more than a year after Barack Obama became US President, the issue of race relations remains firmly in the spotlight.
Arizona's controversial immigration laws are threatening to derail Mr Obama's plans for reform. Professor Jennifer Hochschild from Harvard University is in Australia as part of the US Studies Centre workshops on racial inequality, and she joins us now from Sydney. Jennifer Hochschild, good morning and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Why is race still such an issue in the US?
Well, there's lots of reasons. One is that, of course, it's been a race since 100 years, 150 years before there was a U.S. It's been an issue since colonists first landed on the Virginia and Massachusetts shores. So it's deeply embedded in the whole American psyche, American self-understandings, institutions, practices, economic structure, everything. So it's very hard to change something that's been there from the very beginning. Second, of course, is that it's still a lived experience for every American. People are seen immediately as being black or white or Latino or Asian or some combination of those things. And people's lives are, to some degree, not entirely, but to some important degree, shaped by the way they define themselves in racial terms and the way other people define them. Blacks are more likely to be poor than are whites. Asians, on balance, are actually better off than whites, although some Asian populations are not at all well off. Hispanics are, on balance, more likely to be poor than whites or non-Hispanic whites, although, again, there's some variation there. So there is class variation in all races, but people see each other's race very quickly and respond to that.
Is race still an issue with Barack Obama himself as the first black US president?
Well, it can't help but be an issue. I mean, it's a fascinating question. He clearly is trying very hard not to have a racialized presidency. He's working on issues that are not explicitly racial: healthcare, the economy, Afghanistan, obviously the oil spill, and all kinds of things that are coming onto his plate, whether he wants them to or not. But he is definitely an African American, self-defined. And people see him as that. I think some people support him for that reason. Some people oppose him for that reason. Probably on balance, most Americans care more about his policy issues, or at least I hope that's the case. But race certainly is part of the way people see him and the way he sees the world.
Well, we've seen over the time since he first came to public prominence that there's been some rather strange and sometimes quite offensive underground attempts to try and box Barack Obama in as not only a black candidate but maybe someone who wasn't being truthful about his background and where he really comes from. And there was not so subtle racial overtones to all of that. Has that died down or is that continuing?
That continues. It depends on what the surveys you look at, but you can see surveys that say as much as a quarter to a third of Americans, I think that's too high, but some surveys say it, think either that he wasn't born in the United States, or that he's secretly a Muslim, or that there's something about him that's profoundly and deeply un-American, is the way they understand it. Now, whether that's a way of saying, I don't like anybody who doesn't look like me, and anybody who doesn't look like me can't be a true, real, genuine, legitimate, full-fledged American, or whether there's something more complicated about it than that, I don't know. Those tend to be people who would probably oppose him and the Democratic Party anyway, in the sense that they're relatively conservative in political or ideological terms, as well as, in my view, profoundly mistaken and wrong in racial terms. So in some sense, it may not matter to him politically, in the sense that they wouldn't vote for him in any case. But there is this bizarre undercurrent in American politics, which is not trivial, of people who just don't believe he could possibly be a real American.
And not so much even an undercurrent, it would seem, with the evolution and development of the so-called Tea Party movement, which is a rather conservative political splinter movement in the United States at the moment. Talk us through that movement and explain to us whether it does or doesn't have racial aspects and overtones to that as well.
Well, again, it's always complicated in these cases. It certainly does. There's no question that there's a racial overtone, and you can see it, or undertone, or through tone, or whatever. Partly you can see it in explicit signs or banners that people carry. I mean, there's a probably, again, a small fraction of the Tea Party, but it's certainly present, and it shows up at all of their rallies and all of their conferences. And that's real explicit. It's not an undertone. It's right there on the surface. There are, again, also some surveys that show at least what people would define themselves as racial conservatism, which is to say that they're probably opposed to affirmative action. They're very worried about illegal immigration. They're concerned that African Americans are getting things they don't deserve and that sort of thing. You can understand that as flat-out racism, which I think it certainly shades into on at least the part of some members of the Tea Party. They would describe it, again, as racial conservatism rather than racism. Now, whether there's a meaningful distinction there or not, of course, depends on whether you're the person expressing these views or the person seeing these views. Again, it's also the case that the Tea Party is a genuinely, I'm not even sure it's a genuinely conservative movement. It's an anti-government movement. Yes. It's concerned as much about Republicans and big banks and, you know, economic overlords as it is about lefty, liberal Democrats. And those concerns don't particularly have a racial tone, except that, of course, Obama represents all of the things that they fear and hate most about the government. And the fact that he's black and self-defined African-American has got to make all of that worse from their perspective.
Well, Professor, just finally then, in your view, will either a misinformation campaign, if not outright racism, make it difficult for Barack Obama to win a second term?
Well, that's a good question. It certainly doesn't help any. But again, from an electoral perspective, the deeply misinformed or deeply hostile or flat-out racist members of the American public, who again could be anywhere from 10% to a third, depending on how you count and what surveys you believe and so on, they aren't going to vote for a liberal Democrat in any case. So the question is not their votes per se. The question is the degree to which they get mobilized and get their own supporters in their own selves and their friends and neighbors and people who agree with them out to the polls. And conversely, to the degree to which people who would support Obama, both the Democratic Party and independent voters, are demobilized, discouraged, angry, frustrated, either he screwed up on something, or he's not far enough to the left, or he made some mistake, or it just didn't turn out the way we hoped it would, or whatever. So it's really an issue of mobilization of the conservative, possibly racist right wing as compared to the liberal, arguably non-racist left wing. It's more an issue of mobilization, who goes to the polls, rather than views themselves.
Professor Jennifer Hochschild, we'll have to leave our conversation there, but really good to talk to you this morning. Thanks for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And I think Jennifer has just explained there very eloquently that despite the historic nature of Barack Obama's win in 2008, there is always going to be and always will be a segment, hopefully a very small segment, of the US population that will never accept a black man in the White House.
And he's still, I think, from time to time asked to provide his birth certificate to prove that he was actually born in America and is who he says he is. So those doubts continue, strange as they might seem.